Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. We're tackling a really fascinating period today, one that you flagged as particularly interesting.
Yes, the Roaring Twenties. A decade packed with change, innovation, excitement, and ultimately, some pretty serious upheaval.
Yeah, and you've given us a ton of sources to dive into, so thanks for that. Our listeners are eager to really grasp this era, but, it's easy to get overwhelmed with the sheer volume of information out there.
Absolutely.
So I think our mission here is to unpack the key forces, right? The ones that really shaped the 20s, and maybe even see how they still resonate today.
That's a good way to put it. The sources you've shared do a fantastic job of capturing this feeling, this real sense of a break from the past and embrace of the new. The world kind of shook off World War I and dove headfirst into this wave of modernity, driven by, technology that was suddenly within reach for more people than ever before.
Right. And when we talk about the Roaring Twenties, we can't ignore the economic engine that drove so much of this roaring. What was happening on that front?
Well, both the U.S. and Europe saw a pretty substantial economic rebound after the war. There was a lot of pent-up demand, years of wartime restrictions, and a ton of reconstruction to be done. And all of that led to a real surge in consumer goods.
So kind of like a coiled spring finally released.
Exactly. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There was a short but sharp recession right around 1919 to 1921 before things really took off.
That makes sense. And one of the sources really emphasizes the U.S. coming out on top, becoming the wealthiest nation, really embracing this consumerist culture.
Absolutely. People were able to access goods and services that previously, only the elite could afford. And, that shift had a ripple effect on everything.
It's interesting, though, because looking at the bigger picture, Europe's recovery was a bit slower, right?
Yeah, it took a bit longer for many European economies to get back on their feet. Germany's golden 20s, for example, didn't really kick in until around 1924. American investments through initiatives like the Dawes Plan played a part, too. It was kind of this flow of money back and forth.
Right, keeping things afloat and ensuring those war debts were paid.
Exactly. And it's tempting to look back and see only the prosperity, but of course it couldn't last forever.
Yeah, unfortunately that bubble had to burst at some point.
And it did, dramatically, with the Wall Street crash of 1929. It really slammed the brakes on the boom.
Right.
And, you know what came next.
The Great Depression, a stark reminder that what goes up
Must come down.
Exactly. But let's rewind a bit. This economic surge went hand in hand with some truly groundbreaking technological advancements. It wasn't just about having more money. It was about, entirely new ways of living and interacting with the world.
Absolutely. I mean, take the automobile, for example. Before World War I, they were, for the most part, luxury items.
But things changed pretty drastically in the 20s.
Oh, yeah. Mass production techniques, especially the ones pioneered by, Henry Ford, made cars affordable for the average person.
Yeah.
The Ford Model T became like a cultural icon with over 15 million sold.
That's a staggering number. But even a giant like Ford had to keep up with the times.
Right. Competition started heating up, with manufacturers offering more features, more stylish designs. And eventually, even the Model T had to make way for, the Model A.
And it wasn't just the number of cars on the road that changed. The ripple effects were huge. I mean, we're talking about nearly 27 million registered vehicles in the U.S. by 1929 and almost 2 million in Canada. That kind of growth demands a whole new infrastructure, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We saw a massive boom in industries like steel production. Highway construction took off.
Yeah.
You had motels and service stations popping up everywhere, catering to this new mobile population, the car dealerships, the rise of suburban housing. It was all connected. And, Ford's expansion globally really underlined just how transformative the automobile was.
And then you have radio, which feels like the real beginning of, mass communication. Suddenly, information and entertainment could reach people instantly, right in their own homes.
Yeah. Radio was truly revolutionary in its reach. It was the first real mass broadcasting medium. And while those early radio sets weren't cheap, they were definitely worth it for the entertainment they provided.
I can imagine. It's almost like a precursor to our obsession with streaming services today. Everyone wanted access.
Exactly. And with the introduction of radio advertising, it became this powerful new platform for mass marketing, a real game changer for, well, how we think about mass culture today.
Fascinating. It's like the blueprint for so much of what we see in media today.
And the golden age of radio, as it's often called, was a real melting pot of programming, all sorts of things, just like television in later decades.
So in a way, it was a kind of a golden age for innovation in sound technology in general, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
The introduction of electrical recording in 1925 was huge. It dramatically improved the sound quality of commercially produced records, and that naturally had a massive impact on the music industry and, well, how people listen to music.
It makes sense. If you're going to have all these new ways of broadcasting sound, you need better ways of recording it, too.
Exactly. And speaking of entertainment, we can't forget about the rise of cinema. It was this incredibly affordable and accessible form of entertainment that, well, practically single-handedly led to the decline of vaudeville.
And, it's not hard to see why. Movies were cheaper, more readily available. They could tell these grand stories.
Exactly. And the film industry was smart about it. They recruited a lot of talent directly from vaudeville, offered better salaries, less grueling travel schedules.
So kind of like a brain drain of the entertainment world.
Yeah, in a way. But the really big shift in cinema came with, the advent of sound.
Ah, the talkies. I mean, it's wild to imagine a time when movies were completely silent, right?
Yeah, it really is. And the sources detail this amazing evolution. You start with those early systems like phonofilm and movie tone, which were, well, kind of experimental.
Sort of dipping their toes in the water.
Exactly. And then you have this pivotal moment, the success of The Jazz Singer in 1927.
A real game changer, right?
Absolutely. The Jazz Singer wasn't entirely a talking picture, but it had synchronized music, sound effects, and, importantly, a few scenes with live recorded singing and some spoken dialogue. It proved to everyone that, hey, sound in film could be a hit.
And it wasn't long before the whole industry jumped on board, right?
Oh, yeah, it was remarkably fast. Major studios saw the potential, invested heavily in converting their studios and theaters for sound.
It's like everyone realized all at once that this was the future.
Exactly. And you even saw competing sound on film systems emerge, like RCA's Photophone. Then, just a year later, in 1928, Lights of New York was released, the first all-talking feature film.
Amazing. And sound didn't just revolutionize live-action film, it opened up a whole new world for animation, too.
Right. I mean, think about Steamboat Willie, also in 1928. It introduced Mickey Mouse to the world and featured a fully post-produced synchronized soundtrack. It was a sensation.
Talk about setting the bar high. And by 1930, silent film production was basically done.
Oh, pretty much. The public was clearly ready for the talkies. And this enthusiasm for innovation, for new forms of entertainment, it went beyond film and radio.
Yeah, aviation was making incredible strides, too. Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight in 1927, that's the stuff of legends.
Absolutely. Flying solo, nonstop, across the Atlantic Ocean, 33 and a half hours in the spirit of St. Louis. It captured the world's imagination. And then you had Amy Johnson's solo flight from Britain to Australia, also highlighting the incredible advancements in aviation and the daring spirit of the age.
And it wasn't just flying high in the sky. Some pretty foundational work for television was also being done in the 1920s, even though, of course, it wouldn't be common in homes for a while longer.
True. Those early pioneers, like John Logie Baird, were already making significant progress. We're talking about the first color television transmission, stereoscopic television, and even long-distance transmissions between London and Glasgow, and even across the Atlantic from London to New York.
It's amazing how much was happening behind the scenes, even if the public wasn't quite aware of it yet.
Yeah, and it shows how that drive to innovate was present in so many different fields.
And in medicine, the 1920s saw a monumental discovery.
Yeah, penicillin. It's hard to overstate how important that was.
Yeah.
Alexander Fleming noticed those antibacterial properties in 1928, named it penicillin in 1929. And while its widespread use as an antibiotic wouldn't come until later, those early limited uses in the late 20s were crucial.
They showed the potential, right? Like, this could really be a game changer.
Absolutely. And all these leaps in technology had this huge impact on, well, everything, really, including how people lived, especially in those growing urban centers.
We already talked about how the rise of the automobile led to this massive investment in roads, bridges, and all that infrastructure. But it went beyond just the physical, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Think about all the supporting industries that sprung up, too. Tire manufacturing, fuel refining, a whole service and maintenance sector just for cars. And it wasn't just about the cars themselves. This newfound mobility helped fuel tourism, more hotels and restaurants to accommodate travelers.
It's like a chain reaction, one thing leading to another and another.
Exactly. And at the same time, we saw this continued push for electrification. Industries were switching over to electricity, and production in America quadrupled during this period. Telephone lines were spreading, indoor plumbing became more common.
All these things that we kind of take for granted today, but they were dramatically improving people's lives back then.
Absolutely. And all these changes coincided with this major shift towards urban living. I mean, the 1920 census marked a real turning point. For the first time in U.S. history, more Americans lived in urban areas than rural ones.
So it wasn't just like small towns growing, it was the big cities that were really captivating people's imaginations.
Exactly. There's this real fascination with these bustling metropolitan centers. Think about that skyscraper race between New York and Chicago. It was all about pushing the limits.
And all those people moving to the cities needed jobs.
Right. And that led to the rise of white-collar professions, more women entering the workforce, particularly in clerical and administrative roles. A lot of people left rural areas seeking opportunities in urban manufacturing.
It's a familiar story, even today, people moving to where the jobs are.
It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. And all of this had a huge impact on social norms and cultural expression. For example, women's suffrage. I mean, the expansion of voting rights for women was a massive change.
Huge. And it wasn't just limited to the U.S., right?
No, it was happening all over the world.
Yeah.
The sources mention Canada, the UK, India, various European nations, all granting women's suffrage around this time. It shifted the political landscape. Politicians had to start addressing issues that were important to women, peace, public health, education, child welfare.
So women were finally getting a seat at the table, having their voices heard.
Exactly. And interestingly, research suggests that women's voting patterns often mirrored those of men, especially when it came to advocating for peace.
Makes sense. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right? There was a lot of disillusionment, especially among younger people after the war.
Yeah, that sense of disillusionment, the feeling of detachment from the old ways, it led to the emergence of what we call the lost generation.
Right, I've heard of that term. It was mostly associated with American writers, wasn't it?
Yeah, a lot of American writers, particularly those who moved to Paris, figures like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, they were, critical of what they saw as materialism and a kind of moral emptiness in the culture around them.
So they were rejecting those traditional values, those pre-war ideas.
Absolutely. And you saw something similar in the UK with the bright young things, these, kind of aristocratic youth known for their extravagant parties and rejection of norms.
Rebelling against the status quo. And this rejection of those old ways, it wasn't limited to like a general feeling. It showed up in the arts too, right?
Oh, yeah. You saw a wave of social criticism, particularly in literature. Authors were using satire to point out what they saw as hypocrisy and superficiality.
Kind of holding up a mirror to society, right?
Exactly. And nobody did that better than Sinclair Lewis. His novels, Main Street, Babbitt, Elmer Gantry, they were these sharp satires of small-town life, conformity, religious hypocrisy. And you had other writers, like Sherwood Anderson, Edith Wharton, H.L. Mencken, all offering these insightful, often critical perspectives on American society.
And visually, the Roaring Twenties has such a distinct look. Thanks to Art Deco, it just screams modernity.
It does. Art Deco, born in Europe, spread like wildfire.
Right.
It became the defining style of the decade, especially in design and architecture. Just look at the Chrysler Building in New York. Perfect example of that grandeur and geometric elegance. And it evolved over time, those early flowing curves giving way to more straight lines and streamlined forms.
It's interesting that the sources point out a kind of split in painting styles between North America and Europe during this period. We had Art Deco flourishing here, but Europe was all about expressionism and surrealism.
Yeah, there's that famous saying, data cannot live in New York, highlighting those different artistic climates.
So even though the world was becoming more connected, those distinct cultural identities remain strong.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural impact, we had to talk about the sheer influence of cinema, especially after the arrival of sound.
Movies were becoming this cultural force, weren't they? Shaping shared experiences in a way that, hadn't really been done before.
Oh, completely. The talkies changed everything. And beyond feature films, those animated shorts were hugely popular. Felix the Cat, and then, of course, Disney's Mickey Mouse. It was a new kind of celebrity, these actors and actresses captivating audiences worldwide.
And in the midst of all this, you had this incredible outpouring of African-American creativity, what became known as the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, the Harlem Renaissance was an explosion of artistic and literary expression. The Black Swan Corporation for music recordings, all African-American musicals, the Harlem Renaissance Basketball Club. It was all about celebrating a unique cultural identity. And publications like Opportunity Magazine gave voice to new literary talents.
And this was the time when authors like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston started gaining wider recognition.
Exactly. They and so many others helped shape the landscape of American literature.
And it's impossible to talk about the Roaring Twenties without talking about jazz.
Absolutely. Jazz went from kind of a niche musical form to the dominant sound of popular music. It permeated everything. And the 20s saw the rise of legends like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and, even early country music pioneers were emerging.
It was a melting pot of musical styles.
It was. And naturally, all that great music led to a dance craze. Dance clubs were everywhere. Dance music was topping the charts.
It's interesting how much dance and music were intertwined back then. It's kind of like today with, viral dances on social media.
That's a great comparison. In the 20s, it was all about new and exciting dances, like the breakaway, the Charleston, the black bottom, the Lindy Hop. Many of them had roots in African-American traditions, and they often originated in places like Harlem's Savoy Ballroom. But those classic dances like the foxtrot, the waltz, the tango, they were still popular too.
So something for everyone.
Exactly. And this whole dance craze, it had a huge impact on popular music. It helped propel many recording artists, radio performers, and orchestra leaders to fame.
It's like the dance floor was the stage, right? That's where people discovered new music.
Absolutely. And speaking of changing trends, we can't forget about fashion. The flapper look is so iconic.
The epitome of the Roaring Twenties.
Exactly. And Paris was setting those trends. For women, it was all about looseness, freedom, and a bit of practicality. Those drop-waist dresses, shorter hemlines, bob hair, and cosmetics became much more accepted. Men, they stuck with their business suits.
And the flapper really symbolized this rejection of those older, more restrictive Victorian ideals, right?
Absolutely. The flapper was about embracing a new kind of femininity, rejecting corsets, showing a bit more leg, and adopting that boyish silhouette.
And magazines were popping up to cater to this new girl, right?
Exactly. They were celebrating this new kind of womanhood. And designers like Coco Chanel, they really championed clothing that was, comfortable, elegant, and liberating.
So in a way, fashion was mirroring those broader changes happening in society, particularly when it came to the roles of women.
Oh, absolutely. And women's suffrage was just the tip of the iceberg. The sources really highlight this generational gap. You had these new women who wanted both careers and families, a real departure from earlier feminist ideals that were more focused on political rights.
So it was about expanding the definition of what it meant to be a woman, right? Not just about the right to vote, but about having more choices, more opportunities.
Exactly. And opportunities in higher education were expanding. Advertisers started targeting women as consumers, recognizing their newfound purchasing power. World War I had opened doors for some women in traditionally male-dominated fields, but many, especially black women, lost those jobs when the men came back. However, the booming economy did create more opportunities for working-class women who were seeking, financial independence and social mobility.
So a mixed bag, progress, and setbacks.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. And the feminist movement was evolving too, pushing for more than just the right to vote. They were advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, challenging traditional gender roles, both inside and outside the home.
It's fascinating how some of those same conversations are still happening today, almost a century later.
It really is. And then you have this growing conversation about sexual liberation, heavily influenced by, thinkers like Freud.
Right. And the idea that female sexuality was something to be, acknowledged, explored, not just repressed.
Exactly. People were starting to understand that sexual expression was a healthy part of life, especially among younger generations. And coeducational environments were, in a way, facilitating this shift. Dating practices were changing too, thanks in part to, the privacy offered by automobiles.
The automobile changing the world in more ways than one.
And alongside this growing independence and sexual liberation, you also saw the emergence of what would later be called the feminine mystique.
That's a really interesting contradiction, isn't it?
It is. On one hand, women were breaking free from those traditional constraints. But on the other hand, this idealized image of the perfect housewife, the influential consumer, was also taking hold.
So a push and pull between progress and those deeply ingrained societal expectations.
Exactly. And across the Atlantic, the end of World War I seemed to signal, at least initially, a real win for liberal ideals.
Right. Those authoritarian regimes had been discredited. The focus was on self-determination, free markets, cooperation.
Exactly. There was a lot of optimism for liberal democracy. However, the rise of communism, inspired by the Russian Revolution, started posing a challenge to that liberal order.
So a new ideological battle was brewing.
It was. And something else that might seem a little surprising for the time was the increased visibility and, in some places, acceptance of homosexuality.
Oh, really? Even back then?
Yeah. Cities like London, New York, Paris, and especially Berlin, they became these hubs of relative tolerance. And in Germany, there were even arguments that the camaraderie of the trenches during the war led to a reevaluation of masculinity and homosexuality.
So almost like the war, in a way, forced people to confront these societal norms, these rigid ideas about gender and sexuality.
It's a fascinating perspective. And in Weimar, Germany, various gay rights organizations and publications emerged. They advocated for different approaches to achieving equality. Humor also played a role in challenging those social norms.
So even back then, people were using humor to make serious points.
It's a powerful tool. But it's important to remember that despite this progress, stigma and legal discrimination persisted, especially in more conservative areas. And unfortunately, there would be a backlash in the next decade.
Yeah, history often moves in waves, doesn't it? Steps forward, steps back.
It does. And we can't forget the impact of psychoanalysis. Freud's work, especially, was really shaking things up in the intellectual world.
Right. His theories about the unconscious mind, repression, dreams, they were revolutionary.
Absolutely. They had a massive influence, particularly in the humanities, the arts, and intellectual circles. And other figures like Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, they also contributed to the growing interest in psychoanalysis.
It was like suddenly people had this new lens through which to view themselves, to understand human behavior.
It was a real paradigm shift. And, of course, not all the changes in the 20s were positive. The increasingly restrictive immigration policies in the U.S. come to mind.
Yeah, that was a dark chapter.
It was. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924, they really marked a turn towards nativism.
It's almost like after all the upheaval of the war, there was this desire to close ranks, to shut out the outside world.
It's a common reaction to, periods of instability.
Yeah.
And those laws were designed to limit immigration from, certain parts of the world. They favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while severely restricting or even banning those from Southern and Eastern Europe and most of Asia.
A very deliberate attempt to control the makeup of the population, and it wasn't just the U.S. doing this.
No, similar policies were enacted in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. It was a global trend.
And then there's prohibition, perhaps the most infamous social experiment of the era.
Yeah, prohibition was this grand idea driven by evangelical churches and groups like the Anti-Saloon League. They wanted to eliminate alcohol, hoping it would reduce crime, improve public morals. But, of course, it didn't quite work out that way.
It backfired pretty spectacularly, didn't it?
It did. Prohibition was widely unpopular, incredibly difficult to enforce, and it led to the rapid growth of organized crime. And, Canada had already repealed their wartime prohibition, so there was this huge smuggling operation across the border.
So basically, they tried to outlaw something that a large portion of the population wanted, and it created this massive underground market.
Exactly. And that, of course, brings us to the speakeasy.
Ah, yes, the legendary speakeasy, a staple of roaring 20s lore.
Speakeasies were everywhere, funded and operated by organized crime. They flourished in major cities, often with the cooperation of corrupt officials. And they weren't just about drinking. Many offered entertainment, live music, floor shows, even drag performances.
It's fascinating how this attempt to control behavior just pushed it underground, made it more exciting, more rebellious.
It's the forbidden fruit effect. And, despite all the social and political upheaval, the 1920s was also an incredibly creative period for literature.
Oh, yeah. So many iconic works came out of that era.
It was a golden age for writing. You had The Great Gatsby, All Quiet on the Western Front, This Side of Paradise, The Sun Also Rises, all reflecting different aspects of the post-war world, the changing social landscape. And those pulp magazines were incredibly popular, too. They offered affordable entertainment and gave many writers their start.
So those were like the blockbuster movies of their day, in a way.
Yeah, you could say that. And Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, it wasn't just about aviation. It was a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, he became an instant global hero, didn't he?
Absolutely. It was more than just a technological achievement. It was this daring feat of courage and skill that resonated with people all over the world. and he was showered with accolades, solidifying his status as an icon of, well, bravery and innovation.
And it wasn't just aviation that was capturing the public's attention. Sports were becoming increasingly popular, too, with these larger-than-life athletes emerging as, national heroes.
Definitely. The 1920s was a breakout decade for organized sports. More leisure time, disposable income, the growth of sports journalism, it all fueled this boom in popularity. And you had these iconic figures, Babe Ruth in baseball, Jack Dempsey in boxing, Red Grange in football, Bill Tilden in tennis, Bobby Jones in golf. They were the big five. They dominated the American sports scene.
It was the golden age of sports, in a way.
It was. And internationally, you had increased participation from Latin American athletes in the Olympics. And in many countries, sports became this symbol of modernity, national identity, even a tool for diplomacy.
And we can't forget about the role of organized crime during this period. Prohibition really gave them, well, a huge boost, didn't it?
Absolutely. Bootlegging became this incredibly profitable, often violent enterprise, and some cities became havens for illegal gambling and other vices, often operating with the help of corrupt officials. The wealth and power that these criminal organizations accumulated, it had a lasting impact. I mean, it even played a role in the later development of Las Vegas.
So in a way, Prohibition inadvertently helped shape the future of Sin City.
It's one of those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And while America was grappling with its own unique set of challenges over in Weimar, Germany, they were experiencing this really vibrant but turbulent cultural period.
Right. Despite all the political and economic instability, there was this flourishing of arts and sciences.
Absolutely. Berlin was the center of it all. The Bauhaus Art School emerged, and Germany became this magnet for intellectuals and artists from all over. Many Jewish scholars finally gained access to university positions, and sports became increasingly important, a reflection of this longing for freedom.
So a real sense of, pushing boundaries, exploring new ideas, even in the face of, all those challenges.
Exactly. And back in the U.S., politics in the 1920s saw some interesting developments, particularly when it came to campaigning.
Right. It was the start of modern campaign techniques, wasn't it?
It was. You had Harding's Front Porch Campaign, the increasing use of national advertising, celebrity endorsements, even early radio coverage of elections. Coolidge also used radio effectively during his presidency. But interestingly, the labor union movement actually declined during this period.
So even though the economy was booming, workers weren't necessarily benefiting equally.
Yeah, it's a reminder that economic prosperity doesn't always translate to widespread well-being. And there's a debate among historians about the legacy of the progressive movement in the 20s.
Right. Did it die out, or did it just evolve?
Exactly. Some argue that it faded away, that the political climate became too conservative. Others say its influence continued, especially in areas like business efficiency, social reforms in the South, women's activism, and youth movements. And of course, you have the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan.
A stark reminder that progress isn't always linear.
It's not. And the KKK's targets expanded beyond Black Americans. There were horrific incidents of racial violence and massacres, underlining those deep social tensions that still existed.
A dark undercurrent beneath the surface of the Roaring Twenties.
And in Canada, the 20s were largely defined by the Liberal Party's dominance under Mackenzie King. Their focus was on fiscal responsibility, reducing debt. But you also saw the rise of the Progressive Party in the prairie provinces, representing the interests of farmers. And Canada achieved greater autonomy within the British Empire with the Balfour Declaration of 1926.
So, a time of both internal political shifts and evolving relationships on the world stage.
Exactly. And then, well, it all came crashing down. Black Tuesday, October 1929.
The end of an era.
It really was. The Wall Street crash had this catastrophic impact on the U.S. and global economies, ushering in the Great Depression. And the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 with the 21st Amendment, that was like the final nail in the coffin.
The party was officially over.
It was. And looking back at the Roaring Twenties, it's clear that it was a period of just immense change, touching every aspect of life.
Economics, technology, social norms, cultural expressions, everything was in flux.
It was a whirlwind of a decade. And the sources you've shared, they do a fantastic job of capturing that mix of incredible progress, innovation, but also those underlying tensions, those contradictions that ultimately led to this dramatic turning point.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? We're living in a time of rapid technological change, social upheaval. Are there parallels to be drawn with the Roaring Twenties? What can we learn from that era? It's definitely food for thought. Thanks for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. And to our listeners, I hope this has given you a deeper understanding of the Roaring Twenties. It was a decade that continues to fascinate, and I think its legacy continues to shape our world today in ways that, well, are worth exploring further.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.